Well, welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to have Boris Adjemian, the historian, with us. He will talk about writing the history of a vanishing homeland in diaspora, Armenians in Ethiopia in the 19th and 20th century. Armenians in Ethiopia, how they migrated to Ethiopia in the 19th century, how they made this country their homelands, are among the topics he will talk about. He's an administrator from Nubar Library and Études Arméniennes Contemporaines. He's the chief editor of this journal. In 2011, he graduated from Addis University in Paris, and he had this PhD in the La Fanfare du Négu. That was the title of his PhD thesis, and today he will talk about a summary of this book to us. And again on Friday at 6:30, as a director of Nubar Library, he will have another presentation about the Nubar Library archive and their experiences. So we would like to see you for that speech as well, and we will continue our seminars in February and January. So welcome once again, and by the way, we are broadcast live at the moment, just for your information.
Thank you, Aisha. I totally agree with what you said, even if I don't understand everything, of course. So, thank you. Hello, Parevner. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. And of course, I want to start to address my big thanks. Cherm Shnoragarutunner Haidnel, Hrant Dink Foundation, Ais Heraverin Amar, Hebardem Yev Shatkoem, Arachin Ankamelalo Hoslinelu. Ինձ համար ինչպես որ գերեվագայեք բացարիք փորձառություն մնե եւ հուսամ որ գերգին պիտի կամ բոլիս ցերկով հիմա անգլերենով պիտի շարունակեմ ուրեմն so the history of the Armenians in Ethiopia. So I've been working on this history for about 20 years. Yes. And so when I started my research, it was the kind of topic on which you could find almost nothing in books and on the internet. By the way, at the time when I started my research, you could even not find the internet. So, as you see, I'm a 20th century researcher, not a 21st century researcher. So, I want just to start with a few pictures of the present situation, the nowadays situation of the Armenians in Ethiopia, because there is still an Armenian community in Ethiopia. Only in Addis Ababa now. In the past, there were several cities which were inhabited by Armenians, but now it is only in the capital city, in Addis Ababa. I will display a map later on. And here is, I think it is interesting for you to see the church, the Sopkevork church. It's in the very center of Addis Ababa, in the historical center of the town. But you have to imagine that these are the doorkeepers of the Armenian church. They are Ethiopians. They are attached to the service of the church. The first time I went there in 1997, those two guys were there. They are still there, and there are a lot of Ethiopian people working with Armenian families, sometimes for generations. Sometimes they were part of the families. Sometimes they were part only of the workshops. Sometimes they were speaking Armenian. Sometimes they were preparing Armenian food. And still some of them are doing this. And so it is a very specific situation that Armenians enjoyed in Ethiopia. This is the compound of the church where the community, just before the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, the Armenian community built this building on a land which belonged to the community. So all this land in the center belonged to the community, but the property of the building was confiscated by the new government, the revolutionary government, which was a communist government in 1974, and they left only one single flat to the community in this building. But it is interesting to see this compound because there is a church, the former building of the community. There is also this house who was the priest house at the beginning. And here on this hill, there is the school built by the Armenian community. I have no photo, I'm sorry. The Kevorkov school, Askain Vajaran, who was built in 1930 or 35, now I don't remember, and who was at the time one of the most modern buildings in Addis Ababa. It was confiscated also by the Ethiopian state after the revolution. So it is interesting to see that these Armenians, the traces of the former Armenian presence in Ethiopia are very rare. You can hardly find them. You have to be cautious when you walk to find out these traces because there are not so many evidences of their former presence. This area, you won't cross any Armenian here, usually. But this area was considered as the Armenian quarter of Addis Ababa in the early 20th century. You can see maps, old Italian maps, where it is written Quartiere Armeno. At a time when there was no Greek quarter, no French quarter, no Swiss, Italian or Russian quarter in Addis Ababa, there was a quarter identified as an Armenian quarter. However, in this quarter, Armenians were not living in a ghetto. They were not living together. It was a mixed area, a mixed population who was living in this area. The building you see at the back of the photo here is the Ararat Club Association. It is also a restaurant. Basically, it was a sport association. It is now a restaurant owned by the community. The service and the cooking is made by Ethiopian people, but the restaurant belongs to the community. So it has a status of associative restaurant, let's say. So, of course, there is the question of the writings. I'm not sure I should interfere here with this, but very often people ask about the resemblance between the Armenian writing, Ethiopian writing. There are a lot of legends, I would call them Haigagan Hekiatner, Selov vor Mesrop Mashdot, saying that Mesrop Mashdot, the inventor of the Armenian alphabet in the early 5th century, had also created the Ethiopian alphabet. It is wrong for many reasons. First reason is that the Ethiopian writing is not an alphabet. It is a syllabic system of writing. It doesn't work with letters, but with syllabs. And second, it is much older than the Armenian alphabet. So if there was any relationship between the two writings, it is in the other direction, that perhaps Mesrop Mashdot borrowed some ideas to the Ethiopians. This, of course, it is plausible, but the other theory is a pure Armenian legend only told by Armenians, not in Ethiopia, by the way, especially in Armenia. And on the internet, because now there is internet, there is a renewed interest for Armenians in Ethiopia, and you can find a lot of stupid things on the internet regarding Armenians in Ethiopia. I was talking about traces. When I came the first time in Ethiopia, this area was full of houses, full of small houses, like a kind of slum, you know, houses inhabited by poor people. And this is in 2011. I had finished my PhD. I went back to Ethiopia. I was invited by the community for a special event they had prepared at this time in 2011. And by the way, it was for a concert organized in honor of 19th-Nalbandian, who was one of the most famous Ethiopian musicians of the 20th century, Nerses Nalbandian, that the Ethiopian called Narcis, and they consider him as the maestro of the modern Ethiopian music. And his family used to live in this house. This was the house of Nerses Nalbandian. And the only house that the municipality didn't destroy, because they destroyed everything in this area, is the house of Nerses. And they didn't destroy it because the family said, please don't destroy it. It is a national heritage for Ethiopia. You should consider this. And the municipality agreed that this house should be kept, preserved, in order to make a museum dedicated to the memory of Nerses Nalbandian, the great Ethiopian musician. So this, to tell you two things. Traces are disappearing because the town, Addis Ababa, is changing a lot. The Addis Ababa, who was inhabited by an Armenian community 100 years ago, has nothing to see with the current Addis Ababa. And the Addis Ababa is now a city of about 5, 6, 7 million people, where the small Armenian community became almost completely invisible. Because now there are about 80 people considering themselves as Armenians in Addis Ababa. 80 people, 80. In the past, you have to consider also that this community was never big, never. At the maximum, it was about 1,200 people in the 1920s, 1930s. Never bigger than this. It is interesting because everyone has heard about this community, but the community in the meantime was very small in numbers. It doesn't mean that it has an insignificant importance in Ethiopian history. On the contrary, its importance was very strong in terms of culture, politics, music, a lot of things that I will try to explain today. So it was to show you two things. First, in a town which is changing every day with destruction and new buildings, the traces of the past are disappearing. In the meantime, they didn't destroy the house of Nerses because they considered that Nerses belongs to the Ethiopian heritage, cultural heritage. So it means also that Armenians have been incorporated, absorbed in this Ethiopian ideology of a national Ethiopian heritage. And this is something interesting because it is also related to the fact that Armenians in Ethiopia fully consider themselves as Ethiopian people. In the meantime, they consider themselves as Armenian. There is no hesitation, no problem with this. They all speak Armenian, but they really consider themselves as Ethiopians. They are proud to considering themselves as Ethiopians. And this is something very strong for Armenians in Ethiopia, and I will, I'm sure, repeat it again and again during this lecture. For the Armenians in Ethiopia, there is this strong idea that the Armenians had a very specific status in Ethiopia historically, that Armenians were not like the other foreigners, like the other white people. You know, there is a word in Amharania. There is a word in Amharania, let's say the official language in Ethiopia, the Amharic, as we say in English. This word is Ferenj. Ferenj, it comes from the word Frank. It is used for everything which is European, everything which is Catholic or Protestant, but not Ethiopian Orthodox, and everything which is white. And at large, everything which is foreigner can be considered as Ferenj. And on the other side, you have Habesha. Habesha is Abyssinian, Habeshistan. Habesha is for the people and the culture of the highlands of Ethiopia. People who are Christians, but of the Orthodox Ethiopian Church. People who share the same syllabic writing that I showed you. And also people who have the same, who share the same language, that is to say Amharinia, Tigrinya, two languages which are coming from the same Semitic roots of the language called Ge'ez, which is the liturgic language of the church like the krapar for Armenian. And so in Ethiopia, Armenians were not considered, surprisingly, as Ferenj. So it means that they were not considered as Europeans, which is not so surprising because even the Europeans, they were not considering Armenians as Europeans. They were not considered by the local population as foreigners. They were not considered as white people. So it is very surprising. And themselves, the Armenians, today, they claim that among all the foreigners in Ethiopia, they were the closest people to the Ethiopian people. The only people who understood really the Ethiopian society. And they are very proud. There is a strong pride of this statement. They are very proud of this. Even if it is not historically true, I'm not saying it is the reality, but this is the, let's say, the ideology of the Armenian community in Ethiopia. This is the ideology, the strong idea which is leading the memories they have of their history, of their past. To finish on this introduction, I was speaking about traces, and of course I'm finishing in the cemetery, because there is a cemetery in Addis Ababa. This was the state of the cemetery, the situation of the cemetery, the Armenian cemetery in 2001. I spent almost 2 weeks only in the cemetery just to collect all the information on the graves, because it was very difficult to find traces. It was so very difficult also to find archives. And you know that a historian without archives, of course, is not naked, but he has difficulties to write, to think, to understand the past. So, in a way, when you are working on this kind of topic, you can't come to Addis Ababa or any other place in the world and tell to the custodian, please, show me the boxes of archives where there are documents on the Armenians in Ethiopia, because this doesn't exist anywhere. Even in Ethiopia, it doesn't exist. So it's a topic without an archive. So you have to create the archive yourself. And the first thing to do is to go on the field. That's why my work was a bit also influenced by anthropology, sociology. It was not a classical historical work. So I spent quite a lot of time in the cemetery. And the cemetery now has been well preserved. Now it is in a better condition than it was at the time. And just I want to show you this last picture. It is the grave of Colonel Khosrow Borosyan. I was talking to someone, I don't remember now, Baron Tarpin, a few minutes ago, about the Borosyan family. Khosrow Borosyan is of the family of the painter, the Ethiopian painter Skender. I'm not sure his father or his uncle. It might be his father. I have to check. I'm not sure now. And because he comes from a family of 10 children. His father, Krikorios Borosyan, went to Ethiopia at the very end of the 19th century. He was a small man from Bardizak, a small man without any qualification. He went to Ethiopia. He became, in a few years, one of the main traders to the imperial court of Ethiopia, the court of the king Menelik, the emperor of Ethiopia. And he became one of the official traders of the court. And he married an Ethiopian woman of the aristocracy. They had 10 children, 5 daughters and 5 sons. And some of these sons, they occupied later on important positions in the Ethiopian government or the Ethiopian aristocracy. And for example, Khosrow became a colonel in the Ethiopian army. And he was also he was the chief of the royal household, les écuries impériales, in the time of Emperor Haile Selassie. So he was close to the throne, to the power. Even if his situation was modest, he was not a minister or something like this, but I mean he was close. He had a close relationship with the court. So it is interesting to see that some of these graves have the name of the people in 3 different languages and alphabet, including the Armenian alphabet and the Amharic syllabic writing. So now I should give a few elements about, not about Ethiopia. Well, this is a map of Ethiopia. We don't have time, but I mean, you know where is Ethiopia. And a few elements, key elements about the historical presence of Armenians. So I told you that the numbers were very small. At the end of the immigration, Armenian immigration to Ethiopia, when did it start? Because I'm always asked this question, when did it start? It's an important question. It started in the 1870s, 1880s, so before the genocide, before even the Hamidian massacres, because there were Armenians in Cairo, in Egypt, at the time, a lot of Armenians coming from Arab Kir, and we find that after a military campaign led by the Egyptians in Ethiopia in 1875, a lot of Arab Kertsi, people from Arab Kir, went to Harar, a town occupied by the Egyptians in Ethiopia. So in the first wave of Armenian immigration to Ethiopia, the majority of the people was coming from Arab Kir, Agen, the area of Kharpert. That's why at least 50% of the people were accordingly coming from this area. And at the time, before the genocide, before the beginning of World War I, at the time of the death of King Menelik, Emperor Menelik, which was very important for the Armenian, who was very important for the Armenian community as a kind of protector. At this time, I estimate that there were no more than 150 to 200 Armenians in Ethiopia. 150 to 200 Armenians, including men, women, and children. By the way, Armenians were the only community, foreign community, who immigrated to Ethiopia at the time with women and children, with a family immigration. On the contrary, the Greeks were mostly young bachelors, and the German, the French, the Italians were less in numbers, and they were coming most of the time without their family. And even though there were only 150 to 200 Armenians, Armenians were one of the most important foreign community in Ethiopia at the time, because there were very few foreigners in Ethiopia, very few. Perhaps the total was about 1,000 foreigners in the whole country in 1900. So the biggest foreigners groups were Greeks, Indians, Arabs, mainly from Yemen, and Armenians. And after you had Italians, French, Swiss, Russians, English, but very, very far after in terms of number. This situation changed after the genocide. A second migration wave came from Turkey regarding Armenians, and this time the majority came from the area of Aintab, so the vilayet of the former vilayet of Aleppo. In a way, we can say that there were two periods. There was the first period with Arab Kertsi, the second period after the genocide with Aintabtsi. And this differentiation, you can find it still in the community, because people know, of course, who is exactly from Birecik, from Aleppo, from Beirut, from Bolis, or from Arab Kir and Aintab. And of course, there were also struggles in the past about these origins. I'm sure I have exceeded time, no? I have a lot of things to say. So, I can go? Okay. So, I was saying, I'm trying to keep logical. I was saying that the traces are very few. The traces disappeared. The traces of this past disappeared. How can you write the history of an Armenian community in diaspora, of any community in diaspora, in a place where this community almost disappeared, and where there are no archives. In the meantime, there were things that were not completely forgotten. And one of these things which was not forgotten is this story. Perhaps you heard about it already. The story of the 40 Armenian orphans who were brought to Ethiopia by an Ethiopian king in 1924. And they became the musicians of his personal brass band. This was in 1924. This Karasun Saner, these 40 children, Arba Lejotch, as they say in Amharinia, Arba Lejotch, the 40 kids, they were all orphans from the Vaspuragan, from the area of Van, and they were in Jerusalem after the war, because of course you know that in Jerusalem there was an orphanage, and in 1922 they had arrived to Jerusalem and they had formed a brass band. And in 1924, the Crown Prince of Ethiopia, Ras Teferi, you know, often it is from which is derived Ras Teferi, as say the Jamaicans, it is Ras Teferi. Ras is chief, like Rais in Arabic countries, and Ras is the head, exactly. Ras is a nobility title in Ethiopia, and Teferi is his name. Ras Teferi became later on he became later on emperor in 1930 under the name of Haile Selassie. He was the last Ethiopian emperor before the revolution and the collapse of the Ethiopian monarchy in 1974. So, Haile Selassie, he was not Haile Selassie, he was Ras Teferi, was the crown prince of Ethiopia. He was not yet the emperor. He was leading the foreign policy of Ethiopia at the time in the name of the Empress Zewditu. And at the time, in 1923, Ethiopia was not a colonized country, which was very specific in Africa because almost the whole of Africa had been colonized by European powers, except Liberia and, for specific reasons, and Ethiopia, which had never been colonized. And he was the one who pushed in favor of the integration of Ethiopia as a member of the League of the Nations, the ancestor of the United Nations organization, which was founded in 1919, Société des Nations. So there was one African country in this League of the Nations, it was Ethiopia. They were accepted in 1923. So on this occasion, he decided to pay a visit to the main capital city in Europe. And his first stop was in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, where he went to the Armenian convent, the Armenian monastery, where there was this brass band, the fanfare, and he offered to the Armenian patriarch, Yeri Sheturian, to invite all these 40 kids in Ethiopia and not to adopt them, but to make them become his personal brass band and the brass band of the Ethiopian government, which the patriarch accepted, the kids accepted, and they all went to Ethiopia. And they are well known still under the name of Arba Lejotch. I'm coming back to the first picture, this picture, because it is after the end of their experience in Ethiopia. This picture, it is a photo montage, was realized in Ethiopia. You can see, of course, the Tima Negar, the portrait of the king, Haile Selassie, the fanfare royal, Gaisragan Nevakarump, Yev Kevork Nalbandian, who was the director of the fanfare, of the brass band. Kevork Nalbandian, the uncle of Nerses Nalbandian I mentioned earlier in my presentation, who came to Ethiopia with this group, who directed it as the chief of the music of the emperor, and he was asked by Ras Teferi, the future emperor Haile Selassie, to write an Ethiopian anthem, because at the time Ethiopia had no official music, and at no anthem. So he wrote an anthem. France had La Marseillaise, Britain had God Save the Queen, so Ethiopia had to have its own anthem. So the first Ethiopian anthem was written in 1925 by an Armenian guy, Havak Nalbandian, and it was played for the first time by 40 Armenian kids, orphans of the genocide. And this Ethiopian anthem remained the official Ethiopian anthem until the Ethiopian Revolution. During 50 years, it remained the Ethiopian anthem. So it is very significant, of course, about what does it mean to be a foreigner and to be integrated to a host society, to be absorbed by the host society, to be nationalized in a way by the host society. And also, what was the perception by the Ethiopians of what was a foreign people and what was not a foreign people. So I'm coming to a kind of interpretation. There are a lot of interpretations that we could make, because first I have to confess that we have few testimonies about the Armenian brass band of the king. And the few testimonies that we have, mostly European testimonies, they are not positive at all. Because they all say that the Armenian children were playing very bad. They were playing out of tune, and that their repertoire, the songs they played, were very strange, and sometimes very inappropriate to the situation. For example, in 1929, a Coptic archbishop was invited to Addis Ababa. He was received by the emperor in person, and there was the fanfare, the brass band playing. And when the archbishop came down from the train in the railway station of Addis Ababa, the 40 orphans, they played a French song called Pouet Pouet, which is very difficult to translate. I'm sorry for this, but it was a song about people driving cars and using their klaxon warnings to have an affair together, a man and a woman. So very not unadapted to the situation of an archbishop, a Coptic archbishop. Almost the same year, in 1927, there was an official visit of an Italian envoy, Duke degli Abruzzi, Duke of the Abruzzi. He was the official envoy of Mussolini in Ethiopia. He came to Ethiopia, to Addis Ababa, and there was a military parade in front of him. And the military parade lasted for hours and hours because the Ethiopian army was not powerful, not well equipped, but very numerous in terms of people. So they were walking. And the Italians were waiting that it comes to an end. And the brass band was playing during the time. But at a certain moment, the children played the funeral march of Frédéric Chopin. Very strange, very weird, said the Italian envoy. Said, what's that? And someone explained to him, you know, these are the Armenian children, poor children. They don't know anything else. They had played all their repertoire, and now they play this, and after they will continue, they will start again the same songs. This was the story as it was told to me by an old Armenian man, I have to mention, whose name was Avedis Terzian, who was a very knowledgeable man in Ethiopia, the most knowledgeable informant that I had met in Ethiopia, and I worked a lot with him. But there is another explanation for this strange story of the Marche funèbre de Chopin. Because in the Ethiopian political culture, there is something that they call wax and gold. The semene work, they said. Semene work, it means wax and gold. There are sentences with double meanings that can be said even in front of the emperor, with a first meaning which is very positive, and a second meaning which can be ridiculizing the man or the woman to which it is addressed. Even you can do this with the emperor, providing that you are funny, providing that you do it with a lot of humor. It can be accepted at the imperial court. So this wax and gold model pattern is very deeply rooted in the local political culture. And in this sense, you have to reinterpret the story of the Marche funèbre de Chopin. Because at the time, when the Italian envoy came to Ethiopia and he delivered a speech of friendship between Ethiopia and Italy, everybody knew that Italy was preparing nothing else than a campaign, a military campaign against Ethiopia, because Italy had been defeated in 1896 by King Menelik, humiliated by the Ethiopian army in the Battle of Adwa. It was a very, very tough defeat for the Italians. And when they had first tried to invade Ethiopia in 1896, and 20, 30 years later, Mussolini was preparing the revenge of Italy. And he was dreaming of an Italian empire in Eastern Africa. So Ethiopians knew that the declaration of friendship by the Italian envoy was completely wrong. So in this sense, it makes sense that they could have played, that the children could have played the funeral march of Chopin, because it was saying in the meantime, okay, we know you are coming, but we are waiting for you. And there are several examples like this. I was told even one time, but it is only for the joke, but I love it, that in the 1950s there was an official visit of a Japanese crown prince to Ethiopia. And there was an Ethiopian brass band playing in honor of the Japanese crown prince. And the song they played was the tune of the bridge on the river Kwai, which is quite funny also. So there are a lot of stories that could be told around this brass band. Which is interesting is that this brass band, after the boys separated, some of them left Ethiopia, some of them stayed, the majority stayed. Some of them remained involved in music. And for example, Garabet Hakalmazian, who was a former member of the Armenian fanfare, the Armenian brass band of the king, became himself the chief of an Ethiopian orchestra, one of the first Ethiopian orchestras, formed with boys on the same pattern than the Armenian fanfare, with the same uniforms, the same kind of European instruments. And there is a story saying that during the visit of a Turkish official in 1930 for the coronation as an emperor of Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian fanfare, the Ethiopian brass band, which had been prepared by Garabet Hakalmazian, played very specific tunes for this Turkish envoy. Instead of playing the Turkish anthem, they played Tashnak Tsagan tune, revolutionary Armenian songs. And I know this because the two Ethiopian interpreters that were attached to the Turkish envoy, his name was Muheddin Pasha. The two Ethiopian interpreters actually were Armenians. One was Hovannes Semerjibashian, the interpreter of the German embassy. Another one was his friend, the interpreter of the US embassy, Avedis Terzian, whom I mentioned previously. And Avedis told me, we were sitting with Muheddin Pasha, he heard the Tashnak Tsagan songs, and he said, oh, you came here also. And he was laughing of hearing these Tashnak Tsagan songs. To finish with this, because I think here it has to be told, especially here. There is another occasion, another coronation in 1928. It was the first coronation of Teferi, when he became not emperor, but Negus, which is quasi-emperor. So 2 years before his imperial coronation. So again, foreign delegates are coming to Addis Ababa. Again, every foreign delegate is welcomed in music with the anthem of his own country. But the Armenian brass band at this time is still playing, and they refuse to play the Turkish anthem for the Turkish envoy. So Negus Teferi said, these people have to play. Even he sent his Armenian secretary, because the secretary of Teferi was an Armenian, Abraham Karadzian. Abraham tries to convince the children to play the Turkish anthem. But finally, the chiefs, the Ethiopian chiefs, they say, no, the boys shouldn't play the anthem of the people who assassinated their fathers. So finally, they didn't play. And this is a story which is very famous among the Ethio-Armenian community. Strong story. So, how and why, now I try to accelerate, of course. How many minutes? 5? Okay. 5, it is okay. Himagam popem. How and why did Rastafari, an Ethiopian king or emperor, doesn't matter, why did he choose unexperienced, totally unexperienced Armenian children to play the official music of Ethiopia? He could have chosen professionals, European professionals, Italian, French. Why not? We know also that these children were playing bad, that even Kevor Nalbandian wrote in his autobiography that they were not prepared at all when they arrived to Ethiopia. So, I mean, the situation was difficult. But considering the special relationship which existed between the Ethiopian monarchy and the Armenian church, there are possibility to give interpretation of this choice. First, we have to say that for the Ethiopian monarchy, for an Ethiopian emperor, it was not easy to have European musicians at the time, because it would have been considered as a kind of submission of Ethiopia to a European rule. And we were in the colonial era, and the first mission of the emperor was to protect, to defend the sovereignty of Ethiopia and the sovereignty of the Ethiopian church. So this was a very old problem, and it was the fundamental mission of the Ethiopian king. And in the meantime, the Armenian church and the Ethiopian church had very long relationship in Jerusalem from the Middle Age. For example, there are Ethiopian monks who ended their life in Armenia in the Middle Age. It is very famous. Also, in the 19th century, in Jerusalem, the Ethiopian monks received their daily food by the Armenian Patriarchate, who was representing the Ethiopian monks in front of the Ottoman authorities. There are many things like this who existed, and which make that, for example, between the 17th century and the late 18th century, for about 150 years, Ethiopia was closed to any European traveler, because the Ethiopian church and the Ethiopian monarchy was fearing the proselytism of the Catholic Church. So each time that missionaries were trying to come in Ethiopia, they were beheaded. And some of them even tried to introduce in Ethiopia disguised as Armenian merchants, because at the same time, in the 17th century and 18th century, Armenian merchants and also Armenian priests were still authorized to travel in Ethiopia. So this was very specific. And we have a lot of sources about this. So there was historically a specific status for Armenians in Ethiopia that lasted until the late 19th century because of this church ancient relationship and closeness. And when Armenians started to immigrate to Ethiopia at the end of the 19th century, they were welcomed in a way as if the kings were aware of this long tradition of contact and proximity between their church, their people, and the Armenian people, who was not considered as a threat, who was not considered as a colonial or European or foreign threat, and in the meantime, who was considered truly as co-religionists of the Ethiopian church, because they share exactly the same doctrinal position, let's say monophysite, even if it is not the right term. And so it is not surprising that before the arrival of the 40 children, we had in Ethiopia a lot of Armenians who were working to the palace. They were working to the palace never in high-ranking position, never in a position of a official counselor or a minister like some Swiss or French men or Italian men enjoyed at the time of Menelik, the predecessor of the Emperor Haile Selassie. But they were acting in special fields where the Ethiopian kings would have never accepted foreign hands. Fields which were regarding the mise en scène of the Ethiopian power, of the royal power, and also the domestic life of the Ethiopian royal court. For example, all the jewelers of the court were Armenians after the reign of Menelik. The first one was Dikran Ebeyan. Dikran Ebeyan, he was not only a jeweler, I mean someone, a goldsmith, someone who prepared jewels. Not only this, he was not a craftsman. He was the one who was making the crowns of the emperor. It is very powerful. So it doesn't mean that he had power, but it means that this preparation of an Ethiopian crown could not have been trusted to foreign hands. But for an Armenian, it was different. It was not making any problem. And after Dikran Ebeyan, all the people who made the Ethiopian royal crowns were Armenian until the end, until the reign of Haile Selassie, included the reign of Haile Selassie. There were also Armenians who became the official photographers of the Ethiopian court. It was not allowed after the introduction of the photography art of the photography in Ethiopia. It was not allowed to take pictures of the court freely. So there was an officially appointed photographer of the court. He was Bedros Boyajian in 1906. When Bedros Boyajian died in 1928, I think, his son Haigaz was charged with the same title of imperial photographer. And when Haigaz died in 1941, after the Italian brief occupation of Ethiopia, his brother Torkom, nicknamed as Tony Boyajian, became the new official photographer of Haile Selassie until the revolution. Even the first portrait of the first chief of the Ethiopian revolution after 1974 was made by him. So this is linked to also the tradition that we know very well in the Middle East of Armenian photographers, which served a lot of kings and like in Jordan or other countries, and also the art of photography, which was developed, their input in the development of photography in the street studio that we can observe in Palestine, in Egypt, and in many other places, of course also in the Ottoman Empire. I was saying that, I'm sorry, you told me 5 minutes. I think I'm always at 6 or 7. I have many things to say. Okay. Okay. Questions? Okay. I will try really to summarize. So this is interesting because it shows, I was telling you about the Borossian family a few minutes ago. These are two sons of Krikorios Borossian. So they are mixed Ethiopian, their mother was Ethiopian, an Ethiopian lady of the aristocracy. Which is very important is that their godfather here on the portrait is an Ethiopian chief, not any Ethiopian chief. He was Dejazmach Balcha. He was one of the most powerful political men of the time of Menelik. He's very famous, and he was the godfather of these children. And many Armenian children of families which were working to the palace had as godfathers or godmothers people of the Ethiopian aristocracy, sometimes the empress herself. It happened many times. And of course it was reciprocal. And also there were marriage or burial ceremony which were made by Ethiopian priests for Armenians. So there were a lot of, in a way, this proximity continued for a long time. So, in the memory of Armenian immigration to Ethiopia, there are, of course, the 40 children, but they arrived late. They arrived in 1924. Before this, there were people considered by the Armenians as the pioneers of the communities, the first comers, the founding heroes of the community. These people, Dikran Ebeyan, you know him now, the goldsmith of the court, Hayrik Boros Hayrik Markarian, they think he was the first one because he arrived in the 1860s. He was a friend of Menelik. They say he was a friend of Menelik. We have no written source about this. And although we know that many Armenians traveled to Ethiopia before Boros Hayrik Markarian, but he is considered as Hayrik because he is the only one which is remembered now in the community. And of course, I have to speak about the father of Avedis Terzian, whom I mentioned earlier, Sarkis Terzian, here with his wife Varturi. Sarkis was nicknamed Telik Sarkis, which means in Amharic the Great, Sarkis the Great. And Sarkis is really considered as the true Armenian hero in Ethiopia by the Armenians, the one who introduced new technologies, who brought the first locomotive, in the first steamroller in Ethiopia. At the time there was no road, there were no railway, nothing. Also the one who contributed to the victory of Menelik, the King Menelik, in Harar, in the Caesar of the Muslim town of Harar, and the Armenians said it is thanks to Sarkis that Menelik was able to seize the city. That's why Menelik rewarded him and made him an officer in his army, in the Ethiopian army. And this photo is not a studio photo, it is a real photo. He was really photographed in a campaign against the Somali tribes in 1882-83, this period. And Sarkis is considered as the true hero, the hero by excellence by the Armenians. Here he is photographed, here on this photo, which was kept religiously by Avedis Terzian in his house until his death. This photo had never been published before my book. This photo is very interesting because you see the Emperor Menelik, the chief of the Ethiopian church, the Abuna, Mateos, for the founding founding ceremony of an important church in Addis Ababa, and just behind them you have, with the mustache and the hat, you have Sarkis Terzian. So for Avedis it was a kind of evidence of the proximity between his father and the king, although his father had always been in the shadow, and although all the European sources regarding his father, and there are a lot of European sources regarding his father, are very negative, and they present him as a forger, as a thief, as a murderer, as a very, very bad personage. So it is interesting to see how the memory is constructed, is made, and of course it is not, there is no linearity in this construction. I think I have to end here, and I thank you for your attention.